Happy Thursday, day 14 out of 40. And our reading today is Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 through 21, much of which is a passage from Isaiah that Matthew cites to explain things. So Jesus has been healing people. It's part of what he does. Wherever he goes, the kingdom breaks out. I mentioned that yesterday. He's gracious and loving. He sees people others don't see. He goes to them. He's fearless. He helps people. This is what Jesus is doing. And as a result, the crowds grow. The religious leaders don't like this. They don't like people going to somebody else with their problems. This is part of what they do. It's part of how they get power. They don't like people going somewhere else to be forgiven, someone else to be healed. They want them going to the temple, right? So they're unnerved by Jesus. The Romans don't like the crowds because they just don't like crowds, because they could revolt and all those kinds of things. So Jesus is going to have to move on. Again, there's a plan, there's a path, there's a sequence, there's a cadence that is all leading to this crescendo of Jesus getting to Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. So the crowds are putting him at risk. He's got to move on. The verse just before where I'm going to start reading notes the Pharisees have started to plot against Jesus. So the heat is starting to climb. As a result, because it's not time to head to the cross, he's got to get a little bit lower profile. So I'm reading now Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 to 21. Aware of this, so this is the plotting of the Pharisees. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what has been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. And here we get this passage from Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nation. So again, this is given 700 years before Christ comes onto the scene. So this is a prophetic passage by Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him. He will proclaim justice to the nations. So Jesus is claiming this is being true about himself. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has broken justice through to victory. Till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. So the artwork I put in today is a classic painting, The Suffering Servant. It's Jesus on the cross. And I'm trying to tie this back. So the passage that is being read here, I'm reading out of Matthew's gospel, but it's quoting out of Isaiah's gospel. And in order to understand this passage in Isaiah, you really need to read Isaiah chapters 40 through 52. In order to appreciate Matthew 12, you need to understand Isaiah 42. But in order to understand Isaiah 42, you have to read that chapter in its context. So you have to back up about 10 chapters. Remember, a verse out of context is a pretext for a proof text. So a verse taken out of context is just an opportunity to make that passage say whatever you jolly well want it to say. And lots of people make the Bible say things that it never intends to say. We treat the Bible in ways we would never treat a book. We act as if somehow you can just take a few words out of their context and make them mean whatever they want. So I want you to understand this passage in Isaiah 42, to understand all the things that sort of is going on that Jesus is claiming. So Isaiah was a prophet. Prophets were those who, they did some foretelling of the future, but not as much. They were mostly forthtelling. They were mostly speaking for God to the people. And a lot of what they're talking about here in this section in Isaiah, a lot of this is setting up in particular this idea that Jesus will be a suffering servant. The Messiah in the Old Testament sort of fills three niches: a military leader, a political leader, and a suffering servant. And most of the time, the Jews are just focusing on the first two, the military leader and the political leader, and they leave these prophecies about the suffering servant aside. But Jesus is the one. Until you see Jesus pull these three together, it's sort of hard to know how you have a successful military political leader who's also a suffering servant. But of course, in Jesus, he does that. And so I want you to understand this verse in its context, so I would direct you back to reading it in Isaiah, and I'm sending you to this picture of the suffering servant, which is a picture of Isaiah 53, which is one of the great messianic prophecies. So 400 years before Christ, before there's a crucifixion, so 700 years before Christ is born, 400 years before crucifixion is even a thing, there is a description in Isaiah 53 of Jesus' death, and it has overtones of Jesus dying on the cross. So my challenge to you today, my encouragement to you today, is to read, in particular, Isaiah 53, but you can read as much of Isaiah as you like. Isaiah 53 corresponds to the picture, and it talks about Jesus as the suffering servant, a very Lenten theme. Have a good day.